And let's all take one more moment to thank Maria. So our next speaker, Doretta Marshall, is Executive Vice President and Dean at Wright Divinity School in Fort Worth, where she also serves as Professor of Pastoral Theology, Care, and Counseling. You're good for it, right? Okay, good. Prior to joining the faculty at Wright, she served on the faculties of Vanderbilt University Divinity School, the Eden Seminary. She's also the author of Counseling Lesbian Partners and How Can I Forgive? She is also a co-author of Practicing Care in Rural Congregations and Communities and is the co-editor of Forgiveness and Abuse, Jewish and Christian Reflections, and The Formation of Pastoral Counselors, Challenges and Opportunities, along with a number of articles in professional and church-related journals. Trained as a pastoral counselor, she's in the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, where she served as president. She is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and holds membership in the Rocky Mountain Conference. Please welcome Dr. Marshall.
Okay, after all that sex talk, we have to talk about guilt. Right, so one of the first things you learn when you become a caregiver is that sometimes you have to ask for help. And I'm an old-fashioned teacher. A handout. So if some people could come up and grab some of these and just pass them throughout the auditorium, it'd be helpful. I'm going to let you organize it. How's that?
Are they the same?
They're all the same, just one page. All right, but those are coming around. We're going to start with a little bit of a story. I'm a pastoral caregiver by nature, which means that oftentimes we start with stories, because the stories that are in the group. Oh, we'll wait till the paper gets around. How's that? Okay, paper around. I passed out paper for two reasons. One is because some of us are visual and we like to see the whole thing as we're moving through it. And also because at the bottom you'll find my email address, and I'm glad to send you the PowerPoint if you want it. You just send me an email. Okay, I have a question. Okay, so let's start with a story. The stories that I use are made-up stories, but they are not made up because they're like a lot of us. When I write a case study for my class, I go home, I watch TV, and I write a case study. Because TV oftentimes reflects our stories. So let's imagine for a moment Elizabeth, who's an only daughter, so has no siblings, and is a single mother, and a fourth grade teacher. So what are we already hearing about Elizabeth? By the way, this is call and response. Busy. She's busy. What else? Stressed. How many think she might be stressed? She's already caring for lots of people, right? She has parents, Frank and Mary. Original names, Elizabeth, Frank, and Mary.
She's probably not having her intimacy needs met.
Say it again?
She's probably not having her intimacy needs
Oh, you wonder about her own intimacy needs. Nice. Elizabeth's parents live across town. She's noticing that her father is sometimes forgetful. But like many of us, She doesn't quite yet want to call it dementia or Alzheimer's. She knew that she would have to deal with it sometime, but not right now because it's after spring break. Kids are going crazy. There are things to do before the end of the semester, and in the summer she can take care of things. She trusts that her mother will tell her when she needs help. Now there's a little audible murmur. What's wrong with that picture? She may not know. She won't, or she may not know that she needs help yet, right? Right. One day while she's at school, which is when all good things happen when you're at work, her mother, Mary, contacts her. Father Frank has wandered away from home and doesn't know where he lives. It's that moment when you begin to feel in the pit of your stomach that you have to start talking about it. Elizabeth immediately feels guilty. And why? Why does she feel guilty? I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Turn to your neighbor and name as many things as you can think of for which she might feel guilty. Go. Just name them out loud. Say them out loud so we can hear. Say it again? Neglect. Interesting. She feels like she's neglected. Like she's neglected her parents. Resentful. She's guilty because she feels resentful. Okay.
Selfish.
She feels selfish. Overwhelmed. Let's get this side. That she feels guilty because she's been in denial. Okay? Say it again. She feels guilty because she procrastinated one time too many, perhaps. Responsible. She feels guilty because she is responsible for everything that goes. And we don't know what her relationship with her parents is. How many of you have had family relationships? And they're not always smooth all the time. So we don't really know. She knows that she feels guilty. And what's probably true is that she also feels a bit of shame in the midst of the guilt. And we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is really a complex set of feelings and responses. Sometimes it is a really healthy response to something that happens, or that hasn't happened. But it rarely has a singular cause, as in we feel guilty for multiple things, and usually they're connected in some way. So I might feel guilty in this moment because I didn't realize the day before when I went to visit my parents that they weren't doing so well. And that only connects to the guilt I feel because I know I've disappointed them. And that only connects to the guilt I feel because I'm walking on the earth and not being as responsible as I ought to be. Guilt can become overwhelming quickly. Now, I'm making an assumption that everyone in this room has at some point felt guilty. Or has at least experienced something close to guilt. It's a human emotion, it's a feeling. There's great debate about whether it's a way of thinking, whether it's a feeling, whether it's a response. It's a very human response. Maria, in her presentation right before this, said something about sexuality being a God-given gift. I'm not quite sure if that's the language she used, but it's the language I would use. Our emotions and our feelings are also God-given. They are a part of us. They are part of what makes us human. They sometimes alert us to things, and they oftentimes overwhelm us. It doesn't mean that feelings are bad, it just means that we have them and they're trying to tell us something. So part of what I want to think about with you today is to think about how guilt manifests itself, particularly with those of us who are caregivers in some significant way, whether we're a professional caregiver, whether we have a family member with whom we care, whether we're a pastor, a social worker, whatever it is. How we can think about productive ways for caregivers in particular to process their emotions. I'm going to focus a bit on caregivers, and the reason I want to focus on caregivers is because even if you are the professional caregiver, there are times, I suspect, that you feel guilty for what doesn't get done that day, for the paperwork that didn't get done, for the way in which you responded to a situation. I once worked in a youth hostel agency. We were the place for kids who were either kicked out of their homes or wandering the streets. And I remember early on in my work, going home at night, actually I worked the night shift, so it was very early in the morning, feeling guilty about all that I could not do. And it was that moment when I began to just think about what it means to be a caregiver at a professional level. It means that sometimes you carry things home in ways that are not helpful. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then what's that last one? The last one's important. We're going to talk a little bit about self-care and compassion for self. Because if we do not know how to do self-care and our own, don't have a sense of compassion for our own sense of being, we oftentimes don't know how to care for others, or we don't have the energy to extend to care for others. You heard a little bit about me, but I want to say just a couple more words. I've been ordained for a long time. I'm old, but not that old. I'm an academic administrator, which means that I spend a lot of time behind a desk writing emails.
Yeah.
And I teach in the areas of pastoral care. One of my places of research is in the area of forgiveness. And it's always nice to study something so that you can think about what you're not doing. So I study forgiveness and I think about the complications of forgiveness because forgiveness is a complicated process. It's simple if you do something like step on my toe and it doesn't hurt too much, then I might forgive you. But if you hurt someone I love, that gets pretty close to hurting a deeper core, and forgiveness becomes more complicated. Or if I feel incredibly guilty, it's really hard to think about how do I move forward. I'm also a daughter of a woman who lives in a nursing home a mile from our house. My partner and I moved her to live with us. She has some form of dementia, but as we've talked about earlier today, it's hard to diagnose exactly what form of dementia. She's been in the nursing home for 4 years, and she's on a slow journey, not a fast journey at the moment. I visit her when I'm at home almost every day in the evening. I also have a sister who lives with a chronic mental illness, and they both lived with us. So our family was normal, just like everybody else's. My sister has schizophrenia, which means that figuring out what's real and not real when there are constant voices in your head is a very, very important thing. So when she goes to visit my mother, which she does every day for an hour every day, she tries to help my mother figure out what's true and factual. So here we have someone who hears voices, trying to tell my mother, who's got a very imaginative life at the moment, figure out what's true. In that little story, I think, is where most of us live. Whether it's that exactly combination or not. We live in trying to figure out how do we sit with, how do we wrestle with, how do we engage realities that are not ours, and yet realities that are ours. Because go to visit my mom, sometimes she's actually one of the characters on the TV, and she likes the Food Channel. So sometimes she wants me to help her test the food that's on the TV. So my complicated world is trying to figure out, how do I bring that piece of chocolate cake to her when it's on the TV? And why do I feel guilty because I can't help her understand? Seems like a very simple thing. And yet when I leave Trail Lake to go back home, it sits with me. And it's that sitting with me that I want to pay attention to. Some key elements. Everyone's journey is unique and distinct. There are not any journeys in this room, even if you're in the same family, that are the same. My sister's journey with my mother is very different than mine, is very different than my partner's. So the way in which we have come to think together as a family is unique from other families, and yet even unique one from another. We each have different ideas about what's right for my mom, or how well the nursing staff is doing, or whether the doctor's catching her latest flare-up of some kind of infection. So we each carry around a different set of things about which we feel guilty. And yet, together, because we're a family, my partner is a therapist, so having a therapist sit around your kitchen table is sometimes good. Not all the time, but sometimes good. We also experience different stages and different ways of being in family. So that not only is everybody's journey unique, but every family is unique. Not even families that look similar one to another. I grew up in a small farming community. There were 100 people in my town, which is more than the people in this room. So when I did something wrong on one side of town, it got back to my mom before I got home. Lots of families looked like us, but none of them were like us. So thinking about how does guilt show up differently in different contexts. I'm from the Midwest. Our big emotional response is kind of like, hi. Pretty flat. If my dad got angry, he took the horse out into the pasture to work. If something happened at home, we found a way to get away from each other on the acreage that we had. Every family is different. And what I'm aware of is that, as other participants today have said, you can't get it all in 45 minutes or an hour, and that's actually okay. We don't have to, this is one of the things about which we feel guilty, right? We think we should know it all before we should know it all. We think we should already have it figured out before something happens. Elizabeth might have thought that she should have figured out how to deal with the moment that somebody was going to call and say her father was lost before it happened. But the reality is that even if we think it through, in the moment, we can never, ever think far enough in advance to figure out how to respond fully. Okay, let's talk about everyday guilt and what it is. Because there are different kinds of guilt, right? Some of them are good. If you didn't feel guilty about some things, you would be a little bit abnormal. And maybe even dangerous, I don't know. But guilt is not necessarily a bad thing. There are everyday things for which we feel guilty. Guilt arises when we know that we have done something wrong, or when we didn't do something that we know that we should have done, or could have done. So I'm a Methodist on good days, and what that means is that sometimes we pray that little prayer that says, "Forgive me for those things which I've done, which I should not have done." We know that guilt arises when we do something wrong. And most of us have a good sense of what the wrongness was, but sometimes we fool ourselves. This is part of the complexity. Sometimes we feel guilty for things for which we ought not to feel guilty. For example, when we experience the limitations of our time and energy, is that something for which we ought to feel guilty? Or is that something we ought to accept? Those are different things. When we experience the limitations, Elizabeth, for example, when she experiences the limitations of time and energy and is tired of caring for children and their parents and her own parents, she's experienced a limitation. It's a human limitation. She does not have enough time and energy to save the world. So there's a certain part of that guilt which is not hers to bear. But helping someone separate the good kind of guilt, the things for which we ought to feel guilty, and guilt that is unwarranted, is a challenging thing to do sometimes. So not all feelings of guilt are actually about guilt. And we all know this, right? I mean, it makes sense. So what are they sometimes about? Sometimes they're about shame. Guilt and shame are different things. Guilt is a response to something that you've done, an action that you've taken, or something that you haven't done. I forgot to pay my bill. I feel guilty about it only because the bank reminds me of it. I feel guilty. Shame is something deeper and different. Shame is a deep sense that you are unworthy. And many of us carry around shame that masquerades as guilt. We feel guilty that we walk the earth and actually have resources to buy food, or we feel guilty because we aren't in a particular situation that somebody else is in, or we feel guilty because we aren't living up to our own perfectionist understandings or self-expectations. But oftentimes that guilt is really about shame. It's about an inner feeling of not being worthy, of not being good enough. It's that basic sense that somehow there's something wrong with me. It's not that I've done something wrong, it's that I am something wrong. Shame is a really, really deep and hard thing to dislodge in our life. The antidote for shame, you cannot work yourself out of shame. You cannot work hard enough to get away from feelings of shame. The antidote to shame is acceptance for being human. I would call it grace in my kind of theology. That I cannot work hard enough to prove that it's okay that I exist. Now, we all know people who feel so shameful that the minute you say something to them, they feel like they've done something wrong, or that they're not good enough. And as much as you try to say to them, no, that's not the point, they still feel as if there's something wrong with them. You can't help them get it by reasoning. They have to come to a sense of acceptance. One of my favorite authors is Brene Brown. How many of you have read her? Lots of you. Okay, this is a really helpful book. If you've not read Brene Brown, this is a helpful book. She does a great job of differentiating shame and guilt. And she ties it to perfection, that we feel like we ought to be perfect. And therefore we feel ashamed because we're not. Well, from my own perspective, it feels to me like we ought not to be ashamed for who we are. That is about accepting our own humanity, our finitude, our reality. My sister has taught me a lot about the difference between shame and guilt. So she was diagnosed with schizophrenia when I was in high school. She was a couple years older than I was. And I remember the sense of family shame for having someone who wasn't quite right. I began to mature a little bit and understand and wrestle, I began to realize that there was nothing that my sister could do to fix her schizophrenia, or nothing that my family could do to fix that mental illness. It was a reality that we had to accept. Much like my mother's dementia. I can't fix it. I can't help her see that she's seeing something different than reality. And the minute I let go of trying to fix whatever's wrong, the minute I let go of it, I have a stronger sense of compassion and empathy, not only for my mother, but for myself. Because when I realize that what is wrong with her is something that is beyond my making or my fixing, I can then just love her as she is, not as I wish she would be. Acceptance is a very, very important part of the process. If we do not accept who we are, it is hard for us to have compassion for those who are different from us. And it is hard to have compassion for ourselves. Recommend Brene Brown. So let's go back to guilt, because it's easier to deal with than shame. How's that? So as we said, guilt is something that we know we have done something wrong or we've missed an opportunity to do something. The response to guilt is actually forgiveness. Asking forgiveness, seeking forgiveness, forgiving one another, or forgiving ourselves. Now, that seems, again, like a fairly simple step, right? So I feel guilty, and then I ask for forgiveness, I seek for, which is really good if everybody's on the same page and there's equal commitment in a relationship, and again, it's a minor harm. But when impairment enters the picture, whether it's a cognitive impairment, a mental health issue impairment, an addiction, when impairment enters the picture, it changes the process of how we seek forgiveness with one another. Forgiveness is also an opportunity to hold one another accountable. So that when I think about forgiving someone or someone forgiving me, part of what we have to do in that relationship is figure out what went wrong, why did it go wrong, and how do we begin to repair it or restore it? How do we begin to take that relationship and make it something different? The recognition that things are what they are is still a starting place, even in forgiveness. So one of the ways in which my mother's name is Hope, which is a nice name for someone who, in the middle of working on her own dementia, has to also figure out how do I hold on to what's important to me, which is represented in her name for her. So she has a couple of plaques in her room, and she oftentimes looks at her plaques and says, "That's so good, isn't it, Hope?" There's a way in which she's restoring herself and inviting me into a relationship with her that goes beyond the moment. Acceptance allows us to look at and recognize our human capacities, our abilities. It helps us to lean into care toward others without judgment about who they are. So thinking to myself, I need to help my mother figure out that TV show is just a TV show. Wow. It's just a TV show. She has entered a world that she enjoys. She was a great cook. She was an old-fashioned Midwestern cook with lots of butter, lots of cream. She liked food, and it gives her pleasure. So that when I can begin to accept and say, this is a pleasure that she enjoys, I no longer have to deal with what is right and wrong, what is truth and not truth. I only deal with what she understands at that moment to be her truth. And I can lean into a kind of care for her without having to figure everything else out. Now that's, to me, a fairly remarkable thing. To be able to care for someone without having to figure everything out. It's also a really hard thing. Because there are some things that I would like to talk with my mom about. Things that I think we did with each other and to each other that might have harmed her or might have harmed me. But the capacity to do that kind of work is very rarely present with my mom. Which doesn't mean I love her less. It only means that if I accept that she can no longer live and think and be in the emotional world that I wish for her, that I wish for us, it gives me a greater ability just to be with her. And that for me is part of the gift. The being with her without expectations. It also means that I have to grieve. Because this is no longer the woman to whom I turn to talk over things that are pretty problematic. Or I don't go to her for the same kind of advice I used to go to her for. And I see parts of her life that have slipped away that she no longer remembers that I know were very important to her. And there's a kind of way in which acceptance also recognizes the grief and the loss that is ever present in a way that is oftentimes quite remarkable and rarely named. We don't very often in our world, we don't talk about sex much. We also don't talk about sadness much, or grief, or loss. We may do it in the moment of a funeral, or in the few weeks after that, but then we want people to get back to normal, whatever that means. And we don't really think about how sad we are that the person that's sitting in front of us is no longer the person that sat in front of us 5 years ago or 10 years, and yet still is the same person that sat in front of us. I call these conundrums because I'm aware that when I sit with my mother, I see dimensions of her that she can no longer imagine. And I also see her in the present moment as a loving and caring person, which she's always been. So it's not an either or, either you grieve the old and grab onto the new. They're all mixed up in there together, and I think that's probably okay. I think it's okay to feel multiple things at any one moment in time, although I wish it were simpler. The other piece about guilt that I think is hard to think about is that guilt taps into old things for us. It would be nice if it were one-dimensional. We could say, this is what I feel guilty about at this moment. Let's do a little forgiveness process and let's move on. But oftentimes our guilt taps into old things, into old wounds. It sometimes shows up in ways that are really quite stunning. I remember sitting with my mom at one point, trying to explain to her I decided I was going to step down from administration because I'm tired. And I need a little break from pushing paper. And I like teaching. So I was trying to explain this to my mother. And my mother, who loved parts of who I was and didn't like other parts of who I was, but tried to understand them, said something to me about, well, I always thought you wanted to be such and such. Why aren't you doing that? And immediately I had this moment of anger. But because I'm fairly knowledgeable about myself, I thought, oh, that was interesting, instead of kind of reacting in the moment. And what she had tapped into was an expectation that I knew she had that I didn't have for myself. That's an old wound. And it shows up in this moment. And I can't go back and help her understand that right now. And she can't help me feel like she understands, because she doesn't. So what I have to do is figure out how to deal with that myself. And that's when I really, really look toward other people, other community, other pastors, other counselors, so that the old wounds that show up in a current moment don't begin to take over the current moment. I have a little book there that's on here. Okay, let's talk about how you process feelings. How many of you have seen the little chart with all the different faces on it, and then you pick out the feeling that you're having at the moment? Kind of an interesting experiment. There are lots of ways to name feelings. But one of the most important things is to accept feelings and not as judgments. Those of us who might have a little bit of a leaning towards shame oftentimes have a feeling and then feel shameful. Sometimes we might feel guilty, but we have feelings and then we attach judgment to it. And part of what I want to invite you to do is to think about how you have a feeling without attaching a judgment to it. That is a really hard thing for me to do, and I think for lots of us to do. How do we recognize that something is changing in our relationships with those whom we love? And how do we sit in it, sit in the relationship, and recognize that in this moment, we're experiencing a feeling that is not necessarily going to be resolved in some way. Learning to distinguish our feelings one from another can be really important. So I want to talk about 4 elements of this. The first is really recognizing the different feelings that we have. I'm not one of those who thinks that every sad feeling has anger behind it, or every something else has something else behind it. Sometimes we just have feelings, and it's okay just to have a feeling. But what's helpful is to know when you're sad. When you're sad because you're losing something, or you're grieving something, or you're letting go of something. When you're angry, to think through and to process it and to say, what is that anger trying to say to me? What is it that's wrong? Anger is an incredible gift and ally. There's been several good books, one of them by a friend, colleague of mine, Andy Lester, who wrote a book on anger. He talks about anger as a spiritual ally because it helps us identify what's wrong. When I get angry about injustice, it helps me figure out that I'm angry because we hate one another in ways that kill people. That makes me angry. It's an injustice. Recognizing it and naming it helps me then figure out what do I want to do with it. Sometimes we're just tired. I can imagine Elizabeth being tired as a 4th grade teacher who has children and parents that she's caregiving. We walk around tired a lot, particularly as caregivers, because there's so much on our mind and so much on our plate. Sometimes we feel hurt, sometimes we feel guilty, and sometimes we feel a bit of relief. And we feel guilty because we feel relief. When we moved my mother from our home into the care facility, I remember my sister saying to me after probably about a week or so, I feel guilty because I feel relieved because I don't think I'm going to be here sometime and have to figure out what to do. The relief made her feel guilty. Instead of being able to say, I feel relief and that's okay, and I still love my mother. Those things can all go together, but they don't always feel like they should go together. One of the ancient forms in, we have folks here who are Judeo-Christian, and the Judeo-Christian tradition are the laments. How many of you know what a lament is? A lament in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament Oftentimes in the Psalms, there's a whole book on Lamentations, but they oftentimes begin with something like, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Or, my God, why have my tears been my food day and night? You've been in those moments when tears are the only thing you have. And those are laments. Those are the opportunity to express to the Holy One, to your God, to whomever it is that you understand is beyond. To say, I don't know what to do. I need to lament. I need to name my pain. If you haven't read the laments and you have a Bible somewhere around, look at Psalm 13. Simple little psalm. It starts out with the power of a painful story and eventually moves toward a hope. But first it goes through the story of the pain, and then it moves to hope. Sometimes in our lamenting or in our grief-taking or in a moment we may find ourselves unable to put language to what we experience. We're silent. I was a hospital chaplain in an ER for a while. And it's amazing to me, in the moment of a crisis, people oftentimes go silent. Not a bad thing, not a right, not a wrong, just silence. Silence is really important because there are some things that we can't yet say out loud. There are some laments that we can't yet give voice to. There are some things that are so powerful to us that we find ourselves numb or unable to speak. Laments put our language put our fears and our thoughts and our experiences into language. One of the theologians that I like to read is a woman named Dorothy Swayla, who wrote out of the experience of concentration camps and Holocaust. She used to talk about before one could bring language to the horror that they saw, the inward turning and not having language was important. Another favorite theologian used to talk about silence and numbness as the God-given anesthetic for the soul. A God-given anesthetic for the soul. That in those moments when we don't have words to say, in those moments, whoever we understand to be beyond can hear the words that are not yet there. And eventually we find words, we craft words, we create words. I encourage people oftentimes to write down laments. There's a very simple form you address to the Holy One, however you understand that. You talk about what's going wrong, and then you end it by leaning into hope, by remembering why you might have hope if you ever found it again. The end of laments oftentimes will say, but I trust in your unfailing grace, or I trust because you've always been there before. It's the holy but. But I trust even though in this moment I have no reason to trust. Those can be powerful moments and powerful ways of putting language in. Apologies are another way to process feelings of guilt. Sometimes it's apologies that are simple. Sometimes it's apologies that are only inwardly done because the other person can't receive them. Sometimes it's apologies that you wish somebody else could give to you, but they're unable to. One of the things that I want to encourage us to think about is how we use our imagination. How do we imagine that people who knew that they hurt us would like to apologize? What would they say to us? And then you have to understand that some people won't say that and some people can't say that. I once was working with someone who had a trauma from an uncle. It was a sexual abuse story. We'd been working on the sexual abuse, and the uncle died before she could go and confront him. So we spent a couple of sessions talking about how angry she was that he died before she could go to talk to him. And finally, we stumbled into this possibility that she might not just write the letter she would like to write to her uncle, but write that letter, let it sit for a while, and then write the letter that she wishes her uncle could send to her. He's not there. He can't be there. In this case, he literally could not be there. And yet the ability to imagine what that person, if that person were able to offer a word beyond the grave or beyond dementia, what might they say? Seems like that's a significant way to help people recognize not just the dementia that takes away capacities for forgiveness sometimes, but also our ability to invite forgiveness on behalf of something, again, that's bigger than us. So recognizing when you might wish for an apology is different than expecting a response from someone, right? So if I wish you all would apologize to me, or if you wish I would apologize to you because it's 2:30 in the afternoon and it's time for a coffee break, doesn't mean you're going to get it. So you have to let go of the expectation. And when you let go of the expectation, then you can actually open up new possibilities. So there's a woman who's written quite a bit. If you go online, you can find her work, and I put it on the handout. It's Marsha Wagner from Columbia University. She has a way of thinking about the art of apologies, both how you do it and how you receive it. And again, I encourage you to think with yourself and with those with whom you care or with families, how do you want to think about forgiveness? And how do you wish for forgiveness when the person who has dementia can't participate in it in the way that you wish? Are there other ways to imagine it? Sometimes pastors or religious leaders, rabbis, imams can be incredibly helpful as they stand in with you and help you imagine other ways. Celebrating positive changes in relationships seems again like a small thing, but it's pretty important. I know that my mother will never again come to something I do where I give a presentation or preach a sermon. But darn, if every now and then she doesn't say something to me. I was having a hard time writing an article on hope, actually. And I said to her, I'm having a hard time with this article. It's about hope. What do you think about hope? And she just literally gave me about 5 sentences that were like gems of wisdom that I wished I'd had a tape recorder to record. The next step, she wanted to go back to that TV show she was watching. But you know, in that moment, that was a moment. And that was enough. Recognizing small things is really important. Because in our world, we tend to not be able to celebrate small things because we all have to look for great big transformations. But you know what? Small things are great big transformations coming down the road. So celebrate those small changes. Self-care, compassion, and resiliency. Okay, so if I have one more person say to me, you know, you can't care for someone else until you care for yourself. Yeah, you've heard that one, right? Yeah, well, it's not exactly true, but it's kind of true. It is true that you can't fully give of yourself if you're trying to figure out whether you need to get gas on the way home before you run out of gas. You're thinking about other stuff. But it's also not exactly true that you can't care for others when you're tired. It just means that you have a limited capacity and you have to accept that. So part of what I think is really important is to recognize that most of us, I suspect, are doing the best we know how in this moment in time. We're not perfect. I don't get up to see my mother every day. And sometimes when I go up, I'm really tired, and I hope that the TV's on so we don't have to talk much because I can't think of anything to say. It doesn't make me a bad person. It doesn't make our relationship horrible. It just means that There's tiredness in the world, and it's okay. And I'm doing the best I know how to do in this moment in time. I'm making the best decisions with the information I have. It's not perfect, but I don't think we're required to be perfect. We're required to be faithful humans who are trying to do the best we know how to do at any moment in time. Now, when I start saying that to myself, I begin to realize that I accept other people who are doing the best that they know how to do in any moment in time, even though I can think of 1,000 ways they could do it better. Some of us just have this ability to see what other people are doing and say, I could help you with that. But when I really stop and think about it, and I really affirm that that person is doing the best they know how to do, it keeps me from laying on them the 1,000 things that I think they ought to be doing and engaging them with the one thing that they might do to help themselves, to care for themselves, to take care of themselves. Self-care and compassion is a huge part of what it means, I think, to work with, to live with, and to celebrate the people in our lives who are not as fully there as we once hoped they would be. You also have to have life-giving relationships around you. Everybody has some kind of spiritual life. It may not be a religious life, but it's probably spiritual, whether it's in communication with nature, the wonders of nature around you, the awfulness of nature, or whether it's with a community of people that you really enjoy, or whether it's a belief in a God system that really makes sense to you. Nurture those things in your life. Take care of them, because nobody else is called to take care of them on your behalf. You have to take care of them yourself. Be gentle with yourself. Don't expect miracles out of yourself. Do what you can do, and trust that you don't have to do it all. Give yourself a break. Even in the days when you think you should be doing and saving the world, give yourself a break, to put it on hold and say, I can't do it all. Give yourself the time you need to grieve, to let go, to be at peace. Find those moments when peacefulness is not out there, but is actually in here. And let those moments live with you into the future. It is really, really important that we figure out what to do with our own guilt and our own temptation to be perfect, and live with the people that are around us, celebrating even those people who are not as fully present as they once were, but who we love nonetheless, or figuring out how to deal with some of those wounds and some of those hurts and some of those pains that have walked with us all our lives. Because if we do that, I honestly believe we'll not only be more profound caregivers, but we'll also receive care from people around us. And that, my friends, is good news, that other people care about us as well. Thanks. We have a break in a couple of minutes, but let me see if there are questions, comments, concerns, things you want to say.
From glen to glen and down the mountainside,
Time for a break, yeah?
the summer's gone and all the roses falling. 'Tis you must go and I must bide. But come ye back